And welcome everybody to my little presentation on picking a new monitor. If you're looking for one to do photographic editing, and the reason why I needed to do this is my old monitor died. I had one of these Apple Thunderbolt displays, which are really was quite an amazing monitor. I bought it in 2011 and I spent a lot of money for it, $2,000. But it had been great and it worked fantastically. And just one day up and wouldn't turn on. And so I began the search for a new monitor and the first place I looked, of course, was at Apple, and whoops, and what they have now is this Pro XDR monitor, and it's $5,000 for the basic thing, $6,000 if you want the nano textured glass, and oh gee, you wanted a stand for that? That's another $1,000. So yeah, I'm not going there, but it's a 32-inch 6K monitor and certainly has some great features, and we'll talk about that as we go through all of this. So next slide here shows what happens if you go up to Amazon and just search for a 27-inch monitor for photography. That's what the Thunderbolt was 27. And I thought that's a good place to start. And well, there's a $1,300 and a couple of $300 and $1,000. They're all over the place. And so it occurred to me, this is not going to be all that simple of a project to undertake. What do you want to consider when you buy a new monitor? And first thing, of course, is how big, how many inches, how is it built, what's the resolution, the connectivity, the response time and refresh rate, and the color space. Those are all the things that I thought were important, and I'm going to talk about what I went through in that process. You can buy monitors as small as 12 inches, and however big you want to spend the money for. It really depends on how much space you have, and importantly, how much resolution your computer puts out. But the size really is a personal preference. Somewhere from 24 to 32 inches is what's most popular. But I think 27 inches, which is what that Thunderbolt display was, is the sweet spot for value. If you buy a smaller monitor, you're not going to save much money. And if you buy a bigger monitor, you're going to spend a lot more. How is it built? Well, the most important build parameter is what display technology. And I'm sure you've all heard about LCD versus LED. And then there's OLED and QLED. There's so many different technologies. I can tell you that CRT, that's what we grew up with. Those are gone, and plasma are gone. And gee, LCD sounds old, but in fact, the majority of monitors that you buy today are what's called IPS monitors, which stands for in-plane switching. And they call them LED monitors, but they're really LCDs with LED backlights. And they get very clever with the backlighting. They only light up the pixels in areas where the pixels are bright. And so they save a lot of power in backlighting. But there are true LED monitors, and usually those are OLED, organic LEDs. And that's where you're actually looking at an LED or 3 LEDs, one per color, per pixel. But IPS is the technology that has won out, and for any kind of reasonable money, that's the kind of monitor you're going to be buying today. That's going to change tomorrow. All the information I'm presenting tonight is really a moving target, and a lot of this will change as this technology continues to develop. You want to look at the stand. Well, the Thunderbolt display I had just had angle adjust. It didn't go up and down. So I built a monitor stand to get it at the right height. These days, it's easy to get a monitor with height adjustment, and that'll even let you rotate the monitor vertical. In my opinion, none of that is important, just as long as you can get the monitor set at a height and angle that's convenient for the way you're using it. Another thing to look at is whether the monitor had a built-in camera. That's something I wanted because the Thunderbolt display had it. But as soon as I started searching, it became very quickly obvious that a built-in camera limited my choice of monitors greatly and added to the cost. And gee, you can buy a webcam for 25 bucks that work amazingly well. So I elected to not go for a built-in camera. Monitors have different sizes of frames, and their overall sturdiness is a factor. The one I ended up with is not very sturdy, but doesn't bother me because I set it and it sits up there on the monitor stand and it's good. The most important thing when picking a monitor, in my opinion, is the resolution, which is the number of pixels, both horizontally and vertically. And I used to have that Thunderbolt was a 2560 by 11440. And I'm sorry, 1440. And we'll talk about that resolution in more detail as we go through all this, but it's a lot like your camera sensor resolution, but really has a wholly different impact. And we'll talk about that impact as well. The biggest limitation on how many pixels you can display is what your computer will do. And before you buy a monitor, you need to know what your computer can do. And I think that it is best to run monitors at the native resolution that you're outputting from your computer. So if your computer can only put out 2560 by 1440, that's the resolution your monitor should be. There's no point in buying more pixels than your computer can put out. And if you buy a monitor that displays fewer pixels, you're really not taking advantage of the computer's display card. So how do you find that out? Well, on a Mac, there's this great site. It's called everymac.com. And they list the specs for every single Mac that has ever been made. And that's one of the advantages of the closed ecosystem that Apple offers. So I looked up my Mac, and it says it can put out up to 2560 by 1600. This is a 2012 Mac Mini. Well, that's kind of an odd resolution, but that's what it offers. It can also put out standard HD, which is that 1920 by 12, or actually that's not standard HD. This is a different aspect ratio. Standard HD, as you probably all know, is 1080 by 1920. And so this computer had some strange outputs. Looking further at resolutions, well, what kind of resolutions can you have? And this image came from Wikipedia. It's actually a vector diagram that I was able to zoom into. And at this size, you can't really see a whole lot, but I will point out that every one of these boxes is a standard resolution that you can use, that manufacturers build monitors to, or displays of one kind or another. And the ones shown in red, those are 4:3 aspect ratio, like old standard definition TV. And the ones shown in blue, those are 16:9, like the HD that we all watch on TV. And the other colors represent different lines going through here at different aspect ratios. But the most important one is 16:9. That's what most everybody builds these days. Now I'm going to zoom up into the upper corner of this thing, and I pasted into one of these display sizes color bars, and that's to represent standard old-fashioned television. These days it's called VGA, used to be called NTSC, and I come from the television industry. I'm going to talk about all of this from my background of film and video. And NTSC is what we called it back then, which was the National Television Standards Committee, or we used to like to say never twice the same color. But that was what we had up until 2009. Hard to believe. That was the best you could watch on television up until just 11, 12 years ago. Then in 2009, they introduced HD at 16:9, and most HD at that time was 1280 by 720. They called it 720p. They were allowed to broadcast 1080, but it was interlaced 1080i, and that was quite a bit larger, the 1920 by 1080 that I mentioned. But that has really become the standard, and anymore they don't bother with I, which was interlaced. That was, they would only send half the picture every other frame. Now it's 1080p, and that's what everything is broadcast at, and that's a pretty darn good resolution. A hell of a lot better than what I spent 40 years of my career working in the VGA range. Nowadays, they're trying to sell you 4K TVs, which is exactly 4 times larger than standard HD, or full HD, as this thing calls it. It calls it Ultra HD, and you will see that term a lot, which is 3840 by 2160. You'll also see it called 4K. 4K is actually a 4096 dimension, according to Wikipedia, but pretty much everybody calls 4K this Ultra HD, UHD. While we're on this page, I'll point out that WQHD and WQXGA, well, that's the resolution. The WQXGA is the resolution my computer can put out, and the WQHD is the resolution of my old Thunderbolt monitor. And that's sort of where I'm headed for my search. But nowadays, you're going to start seeing people promoting 8K or Ultra HD 2. And that is 4 times larger than 4K. And oh my God, do we need that many pixels? So good question to ask. And I answered it with some research. If you go out onto the web and see, well, how big of a TV is it worth getting? I have a 60-inch TV and I sit about 9 feet away from it. So that's that little red dot. And this says that, well, gee, I wouldn't be able to see the improvement of a 4K monitor sitting at 60 inches, sitting at the distance that I do sit. I would have to be closer than 7 feet to that HD 60-inch monitor to be able to see 4K. Well, so that's a little bit of my political opinion. I don't think 4K is really appropriate, and 8K is certainly not. But we'll all be sold it and we'll end up buying it. Then the question is really, what do you need? So this came from a great article, Everything You Need to Know About Image Resolution, that I found on the web. And this really applies to printing as well. DPI and PPI are really the same thing. DPI is the term they use in print for dots per inch, and PPI is the term they use for monitors for pixels per inch. But if you're printing something you're going to look at within 2 feet, this says you need 300 DPI. assuming that a human can see 1 arc minute of angle. And that if you're going to be sitting 3 or 5 feet away, you don't need that much. Well, my 9 foot or 10 foot away says I need 60 DPI to look at my 60-inch monitor. Well, my 60-inch monitor is full HD. It's giving me 1920 pixels, and that 60 inches is an diagonal measurement. So if you do the math, that's actually only 52 inches of pixels wide in the 1920 direction. And that works out to 37 pixels per inch. Well, that doesn't sound very good. You would think that would look pretty bad, but it looks great. I certainly can't see the pixels. And even if I had younger eyes, I don't think I would be able to. The whole how many pixels do you need thing is a topic we can debate hotly. And I'm sure we will when I get done talking. But back in the old days, computer monitors, you're going to be sitting 18 inches, 2 feet away. And when Apple first came out, they standardized at 72 dots per inch or PPI. That was really convenient because it worked out to 1 pixel was 1 point. So a 12-point type was 12 pixels tall. But it did look pretty jagged, and the technology got better. So 96 PPI became a standard where the jaggies weren't too objectionable. You didn't really mind the blocks from the pixels. But as technology got better and better, the standard went away, and now monitors are however many pixels the manufacturer feels like making. That Thunderbolt 27 I was talking about worked out to 109 pixels per inch. If you buy a 27-inch monitor that's 4K, that works out to 164 pixels per inch. If you crank it up to 32 inches, it's still 138 pixels per inch. And if you bought that 32-inch $6,000 Apple monitor that I mentioned at the beginning, that's 218 pixels per inch. Why does it really matter as long as it's more than you need? As long as it doesn't look jaggy? It's really a question of how much you can fit on the screen. But there is one thing to keep in mind, and that is when you're in Lightroom and you put it to 1:1, or I think I saw they changed that to percentage from Kathy's presentation 2 weeks ago. So if it's 100%, that means that 1 pixel of your photograph is mapped to 1 pixel of your display. And that's good to know. But your computer knows all this. So if you open a PDF that's supposed to be 8.5 by 11, and you hold a ruler up to your screen, if everything's working properly, that PDF will display at 11 by 8.5. So that's a little background on resolution. The next topic is connectivity, and that is what kind of connection does the monitor have to connect to your computer? And the most popular ones are HDMI, DisplayPort, mini DisplayPort, or USB-C. The old RCA jacks that you had a video and a left and right audio, those are a thing of the past. They mean as much to a monitor these days as ketchup, mayonnaise, and mustard. The only thing about connectivity that is really important to know is that it is easy to go ahead and pick HDMI and use it to connect your monitor, but that may force you, and I found that was true with my computer. If I used the HDMI port, it would only output standard full HD 1920. It would not give me the full 2600 pixels that I was capable of viewing and outputting. So you want to use the appropriate port, and in my case was a mini DisplayPort. Response time and refresh rate. Well, these are very important if you're a gamer and you want to twitch to the fastest move of the that your gaming game puts out. But unless you're watching a hockey puck or a golf ball or jittering to gaming, all modern monitors are fast enough that you don't really need to worry about any of this. That's my opinion. When I get done, you can argue with me on this. The other second most important thing when you're picking a monitor after resolution is the color space. And this is going to affect the price of the monitor. Now, I got this diagram from the Lightroom Queen, which is a great web resource for Lightroom. I learned a lot visiting this site, and she has this great little diagram that quickly just describes the four main color spaces that are in use when they talk about what a monitor can display as far as color goes. But this color display that you see and is very commonly used to display color space is really a lie. It's a three-dimensional color space. You've got luminance in the depth dimension. So you can't really see a lot of what the color space represented by these various ones are. sRGB is sort of the base standard. Adobe RGB, I think many of us use when we are in Lightroom, and it's great if you're going to go to a printer, because they all know what it is. But if you want better color, more gamut, this P3 is what that Apple XDR display does. And then according to the Lightroom Queen, ProPhoto is Adobe's largest color space that they want you to use if you're going back and forth to Photoshop. But that's not really relevant to what you can get in a monitor. So gamut is that triangle of how much color space that monitor will make. And if you buy a monitor that says it's 100% sRGB, that really is sort of my base standard for what you need to do photo editing. And if you want to spend a little more money as you're looking at these monitors, you'll see monitors that do 100% of Adobe RGB or only 98 or 99% of Adobe RGB. It is 10-bit. It's billions of colors rather than hundreds of millions of colors. And you will see the benefit reflected in the cost of the monitors. And then, of course, the display P3 that the XDR monitor does is the sort of the best you can get out of a monitor these days. The one thing I will also say about color gamut is that you can buy monitors that are factory calibrated. And that's what I did. And I think it was a worthwhile thing to pay for. The alternative is to calibrate your monitor at home, and that probably will get you better results if you have the equipment to actually do that. But it does take one of these clamp-on devices that will look at your screen and feed back to the computer what it's outputting. So factory calibration is a worthwhile thing. The last set of parameters I'll talk about briefly is dynamic range, and that's how many nits of brightness the monitor will put out and what the contrast ratio is. The direct view OLED monitors definitely seem to do better on these, but most monitors output what's considered to be standard dynamic range. You'll find a few that claim to be HDR or some that actually comply to an emerging standard for HDR called HDR10. But when you're editing photos for other people to view on their monitors or to go to a print house, the reality is that a lot of what you see in HDR will only be visible on an HDR monitor that you're looking at in your home. So standard dynamic range is probably going to be good enough. And that's, again, what I chose. So here's the monitor that I ended up with. Was an Asus ProArt and 27 that matched my computer's capability of output, except for the 1440 versus the 1600. Nobody's making a 1600 vertical non-16 by 9 monitor, so I had to go with that 1440 number. It is 100% sRGB. It supported the display port that I needed. It had this Kalman verified certification, which means that it was factory calibrated. So, and it came with a tilt and a height adjustable display mount that I didn't really care about, but it was an incredibly cheap $335. Monitors have really, really gotten so much better. And for somebody that spent as much time looking at CRTs as I did, it's incredible how great they are. And with that, I have finished my presentation. I will unshare my screen and invite you to discuss this.
Hey, Tom, well done. That was very informative. I appreciate that.
And let me stop the recording.